The clock on the microwave reads 6:42 a.m. when the grinding sound began. It was a low, guttural noise, the sound of heavy machinery protesting the cold morning air. I was at my kitchen table, a simple oak thing my wife Eleanor had picked out decades ago, nursing my first cup of coffee. The steam rose in a lazy spiral, carrying the scent of dark roast and chicory through the quiet house. Through the large window over the sink, I could see the source of the disturbance. A flatbed truck, a small bulldozer no bigger than a large riding mower, and a handful of men in bright yellow vests were congregating at the edge of my property line, right where the old pasture meets the manicured lawns of the subdivision. And in the middle of them, pointing and gesticulating with a rolled-up set of what looked like architectural plans, was Brenda. She was wearing a pink tracksuit, the kind with sequins on the jacket, which seemed wildly inappropriate for directing a demolition crew at dawn. Her hair was a helmet of blonde spray, unmoving in the gentle breeze. She was the president of our homeowners association, a title she wore with the gravity of a Roman emperor. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was black, no sugar. I watched as one of the men started the bulldozer. The grinding intensified, and the machine lurched forward, its metal tracks chewing up the soft grass. They were heading for the barn. My barn. I set my mug down with a quiet click, stood up, and walked to the back door. I did an art rush. I slid my feet into a pair of old work boots. I kept on the mat, grabbed my phone from the counter, and stepped out onto the dew-soaked porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cut grass. The sun was just beginning to crest the line of pine trees to the east, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Brenda saw me. Her posture straightened, a performer spotting her audience. She broke away from the crew and marched toward me, the ridiculous plan still clutched in her hand like a scepter. "Ah, Mr. Peterson," he called out, her voice sharp and carrying in the still morning air. "I am glad to see you. You can witness the wonderful community improvement you forced our hand on." I stopped at the edge of my porch steps, about 50 feet from where she stood. I didn't say anything. I just raised my phone and hit the record button. The small red light was barely visible, but I knew it was on. "As you were notified multiple times," she continued, her voice dripping with condescending patience, "this derelict structure is in violation of Sections 4B7G. ETA's an eyesore and a safety hazard." She took a few more steps toward me, crossing from the common area onto my lawn. Her sneakers were white, and they were now getting stained with green. The Covenants Committee has voted unanimously. This structure is being removed by order of the Board of Directors of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. All costs associated with the demolition and removal will be assessed to your property account, along with all previously levied fines for non-compliance. She was performing. This was not a conversation. It was a declaration. A speech for the benefit of the yellow-vested men who were now looking on, with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. I remained silent. I kept the phone steady, framing her with the old gray wood barn in the background. The bulldozer idled noisily behind her. Her smile tightened. My silence was not the reaction she wanted. She wanted an argument. She wanted a fight, a shouting match that would validate her aggression. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Peterson?" she snapped, the faux patience gone. Are you just going to stand there like a garden gnome?" I lowered the phone slightly. I looked past her, at the barn. It had stood on this land since 1890. Its timbers were hand-hewn oak. Its foundation was fieldstone pulled from the very earth it sat on. It had seen seasons and families, and the slow creep of progress turned the surrounding farmland into a sea of identical beige, houses with two-car garages. It was tired, yes. It was old. But it was mine. I looked back at Brenda, her face flushed with righteous indignation. I let the silence hang for another moment. Then I spoke, my voice calm and low. Brenda, I said, making sure to use her first name, a small act of denying her the authority of her title. You are trespassing. The statement was so simple, so devoid of the emotion she was expecting, that it stopped her cold. She blinked. I am the president of the HOA, she said, as if that were a diplomatic immunity. I am acting on behalf of the community. Your crew and your machines are on my private property, I continued, my tone unchanged. And I am asking you to leave. Ah, she scoffed, a short, ugly sound. This is common property. The back lots are all under HOA jurisdiction for maintenance. She was wrong, but she said it with such absolute conviction. On paper, her confidence was a fortress. In reality, she turned her back to me, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Proceed, she shouted to the man on the bulldozer. Tear it down. I didn't shout back. I didn't run toward them. I just stood on my porch, phone still recording, and watched as the machine's shovel bit into the soft weathered wood of the barna's corner. The sound was a sickening crunch, a final groan from something that had stood for over 130 years. I zoomed in with the camera, capturing the splintering wood, the look of triumph on Brenda's face, the precise timestamp on the video file. She had no idea. She had no idea she was demolishing the only thing keeping her prize-winning rose garden from becoming a permanent wetland. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who spent 40 years designing drainage systems for a living. She had no idea what was written on paper. But before I get to what happened next, to the certified letters and the sheriff's deputies and the emergency town hall meeting that would ultimately ruin her, I should probably explain. I should explain who I am, and more importantly, what that old barn really was. My name is Arthur Peterson. I am 72 years old. For 43 years, I was a civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, and then later, a private consultant. My specialty was hydrology and land management. That is a fancy way of saying I spent my life studying how water moves over and through the ground. I designed levees, dams, urban storm drains, and complex watershed management systems. I have worked in the Mississippi Delta, the Florida Everglades, and the arid landscapes of the Southwest. I understand in a way that most people never have to, that water is patient, relentless, and it always wins. You don't tell water where to go. You gently persuade it. You build it a path of least resistance and hope it agrees with your assessment. My entire professional life was about reading the land, understanding its history, and respecting its nature. It was a life lived on paper, in blueprints, topographical maps, geological surveys, and 1,000-page environmental impact reports. I am a man of details, of documents, of process. I am not a man of conflict. Eleanor, my wife, was the one who handled conflict. She was a force of nature, a high school principal who could quell a cafeteria riot with a single well-placed glare. She was the heart of our life, the vibrant social center to my quiet, methodical core. When she passed away 2 years ago from a sudden illness, the silence in our big family home was deafening. It was too full of her absence. So I sold it. I bought this place, a small 2-bedroom house at the very back of the Oak Ridge Meadows subdivision. It was the only house in the development that wasn't a cookie-cutter model. It was an older farmhouse renovated, but it came with 5 acres of land that backed up onto a state forest and, most importantly, the old barn. The listing agent had called the barn a teardown, a liability. I saw it as an asset. I saw the history. I saw the peace. I wanted to live out my days in quiet solitude, reading my books, tending a small garden and listening to the birds. I had no interest in neighborhood drama. Brenda, however, lived for drama. She had been elected HOA president the year before I moved in, running on a platform of restoring community values, which seemed to translate into a reign of terror over trivialities. She was a recent transplant herself, married to a man who had made a fortune in some kind of vague software sales. They had the biggest house on the block, the one with the professionally landscaped garden and the 3-car garage. She had no professional life of her own that I could discern, and so she had poured all of her formidable and misguided energy into the HOA. Her rule was absolute, and her interpretation of the covenants was both draconian and breathtakingly ignorant. In my first year, I watched her fine old Mr. Henderson, $75, because his tomato plants were visible from the street, a violation of the No Unsightly Vegetable Gardens clause she'd invented. I saw her send a threatening letter to the Millers because their Sona's basketball hoop was a non-approved shade of orange. She measured people's lawns with a ruler. She dictated the acceptable color palette for holiday decorations. She was a petty tyrant, ruling a tiny beige fiefdom. The barn became her obsession. From the moment I closed on the house, to her, it was an affront to the uniform mediocrity she was trying to cultivate. It didn't match. It stood on a slight rise at the back of my property, which sloped down gently from the rest of the subdivision. The land around here is mostly clay, with a high water table. It is a swampy area, geologically speaking. The developers who built Oak Ridge Meadows in the late 1972 had to do a significant amount of grading and install a network of French drains and culverts to make the land viable for construction. What Brenda, and likely everyone else, didn't know was that the linchpin of this entire drainage system wasn't a modern piece of civil engineering. It was the barn. The man who built it in 1890. A farmer named Silas Croft was no trained engineer, but he understood his land. He built the barn on the highest point of his acreage, but he set its stone foundation deep. Had laid a complex, gravity-fed drainage network of perforated clay, tiles, and gravel beds, all channeling the area's significant groundwater and storm runoff into a deep, stone-lined cistern hidden beneath the barn's floorboards. From there, a primary outflow pipe, now long since integrated into the county storm sewer, carried the excess water away. For nearly a century and a half, that barn had been quietly, passively, keeping the entire surrounding area from turning back into the bog it wanted to be. The kindness of the previous owner, a sweet old woman who let the developers tie their new drains into her old system, had been forgotten. History had been paved over. Brenda saw a derelict building. I saw a critical piece of infrastructure. From the day I moved in, I knew Brenda would be a problem, so I prepared. I am a man who believes in documentation. For me, it's not just a professional habit, it's a world view. If it's not on paper, it did happen. I kept every email, every newsletter, every notice from the HOA. When Brenda sent me my first INEA $25 for my mailbox, leaning half a degree past vertical, I did not argue. I took a photo of the mailbox with a level, clearly showing it was perfect, printed the photo, attached it to the notice, and paid the fine with a personal check. On the memo line I wrote, "Paid under protest, violation ref, 2021 MB 01. I mailed it with return receipt requested. I kept a copy of the check, the photo, the notice, and the signed receipt from the post office. I filed them away. I did this for every single baseless fine she sent me. The overgrown lilac bush. It was not overgrown. The unapproved bird feeder, the covenants said nothing about bird feeders. The lawn being a quarter-inch too high the week I had the flu. Each time I document it, paid under protest, and filed. I was building a record. I was keeping the receipts. My folder, a simple, thick, green accordion file, grew heavier with each passing month. It was a meticulous catalogue of her harassment, all on paper, all undeniable. I was just a quiet old man, living alone. She had no idea who I was, and she had no idea what I was doing. My first attempt to reason with her was, in retrospect, a naive gesture. About 6 months before the demolition, her campaign against the barn began in earnest. I received the first official notice. It was a form letter, filled with legal-sounding but ultimately meaningless phrases like "pursuant to" and "henceforth." It cited the covenants Shade mentioned that morning and demanded the barn be removed within 90 days, at my own expense. I did not email her back, I did not call. An argument with a person like Brenda is a fool's errand. You cannot win a battle of logic with an illogical person. Instead, I went to work. I drove to the county records office. I pulled the original plat map for the Oak Ridge Meadows subdivision, dated 1978. I also pulled the deed for my own property, which referenced an even older survey from 1888. I spent an afternoon making high-quality digital scans and certified paper copies. Then, I prepared a package. It contained the certified copy of my deed, which clearly described my property boundaries. It contained the 1978 subdivision plat, which showed my 5-acre parcel, and the barn designated as existing structure, not a part of this plat. This meant it was explicitly excluded from the HOA jurisdiction. I also included a new boundary survey I had commissioned myself from a reputable local firm, just to be thorough. The survey stakes, bright pink flags on wooden posts, were still visible around my property line if anyone cared to look. Finally, I wrote a simple one-page letter. In it, I calmly explained that the barn was situated entirely on my private property, was not subject to the HOA covenants as per the original plat, and that any attempt to enter my property to alter or remove it would be considered trespassing. I also took the opportunity to gently educate her. I included a brief layman's terms explanation of the integrated drainage system, complete with a simplified diagram I drew myself, showing how the barn's foundation served as the central hub for the neighborhood's stormwater management. I suggested that destroying it would have significant and unforeseen hydrological consequences for the adjacent properties. I was trying to give her an out, a way to back down without admitting she was wrong. She could have framed it as a discovery, a new understanding of the situation. I sent this package to the HOA's official address, via certified mail, return receipt requested. I sent a second copy to Brenda's home address, also certified. 2 weeks later, both green signature cards came back to me in the mail. One was signed by Brenda herself, the other by the HOA's part-time secretary. She had received it. It was on paper. Her response came, not in a letter, but at the next monthly HOA meeting. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, recorded all the meetings on a small digital recorder he kept in his pocket. He did it for his own protection. He gave me a copy of the audio file the next day. I listened to it in my office. Brenda's voice was dripping with scorn. "Our newest resident, Mr. Peterson," she announced during the new business portion, "has sent us a very creative letter. It's full of hand-drawn maps and what he calls a historical evidence. He seems to believe his ramshackle death trap of a barn is some kind of historic landmark." There was sycophantic laughter from her allies on the board. He even included a fake survey map, trying to claim the land isn't part of the HOA. Rest assured, the board has consulted our legal counsel, and we are moving forward. We will not be intimidated by scare tactics and fraudulent documents. She had lied, of course. I knew for a fact the HOA's legal counsel was a cut-rate firm that only handled collections. They would know how to read a plat map if it was printed on a dinner menu. And she had thrown my warning in the trash, dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. She had publicly declared my evidence fraudulent. This was a gift. Her arrogance was becoming my greatest asset. That was the moment I knew. This would not end quietly. She had been warned. The warning was documented. Her rejection of the warning was now documented. The path was clear. I retreated from direct confrontation. I went back to my desk and got to work. I called my old friend and colleague David Chen. David had been a lawyer for the Corps of Engineers with me for 20 years before leaving to start a private practice specializing in land use and property law. He was, if anything, even more meticulous than I was. "Arrarr," he said, his voice warm over the phone. To what do I owe the pleasure? Donnet. Tell me, you finally decided to sue the government over your pension. Something far more interesting, David, I replied. I am dealing with an HOA. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a deep sigh. Arthur, my friend, he said wearily, of all the foes you could choose. You fought corporations, you fought state governments, you fought the very rivers themselves. But an HOA, that's a battle of pure, uncut, crazy. Are you sure you're up for it? I have a folder. David, I said, and I think it's time we weaponized it. Over the next few months, David and I systematically assembled a fortress of paperwork. We didn't just rely on my deeds and surveys, we went deeper. We pulled the county tax records for every single property in the subdivision, tracing the chain of title back to the original farmland. We obtained the minutes from the County Planning Commission meetings from 1977 and 1978, the ones where the Oak Ridge Meadows development was debated and approved. We downloaded satellite imagery from the USGS archive, showing the land before, during, and after the subdivision was built. We even found aerial photographs from the 1,950 seconds that clearly showed the barn and the natural water flow of the land around it, and that's where we found it. The bombshell. It was buried on page 347 of the appendix to the Planning Commission's final approval report from the 12th of April, 1978. It was a hydrological engineering report commissioned by the original developer. The report stated, in no uncertain terms, that the land was unsuitable for the proposed density of housing due to the high water table and poor soil drainage. The commission was set to deny the building permit. But the developer, a man named Frank Miller, was clever. He negotiated a variance. The variance was granted on one single critical condition. I read the words aloud to David over the phone, my voice quiet with the thrill of discovery. Approval is contingent upon the developer's agreement to integrate the new subdivision as stormwater management system, functional agricultural drainage infrastructure located on Parcel 7B that was my property, and to establish a permanent drainage easement to ensure the continued unimpeded function of said system in perpetuity. David let out a low whistle. In perpetuity, Arthur. That is the magic word. It means forever. Does the HOA's Declaration of Covenants mention this easement? It does, I said, flipping through a copy of the thick convoluted document, Appendix F, Section 2, Paragraph A. It references the county variance by its official number. It is right there buried in the boilerplate. I guarantee you, not a single person on that board has ever read this far. So Brenda isn't just threatening to trespass on your property and destroy your barn, David said, a new energy in his voice. She is threatening to willfully violate a recorded county variance and a permanent, legally binding easement that the entire subdivision's existence depends on. That is about the size of it, I said. Oh, Arthur, David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. This is better than a pension lawsuit. Ed, this is better. This is poetry. We had it. The key that unlocked the whole thing. Her actions weren't just a violation of my property rights. They were a violation of the legal foundation of her own home, and the homes of everyone she purported to represent. On paper, she was already finished, she just hadn't realized it yet. All we had to do was wait for her to make the final, irrevocable mistake. Which brings us back to that morning, with the bulldozer tearing into the side of my barn. After my brief recorded exchange with Brenda, and after she ordered her crew to proceed, she must have decided my quiet defiance was a threat. She pulled out her phone and I heard her say with performative panic in her voice, yes, I need the sheriff's department. There is a man here, a resident. He's becoming very aggressive. He's threatening the work crew. We're on HOA common property, and he's trying to intimidate us. Please send someone right away." It was a masterful performance of victimhood. She was creating her own narrative, one in which she was the brave community leader standing up to a belligerent old man. I almost had to admire the audacity. I simply stood my ground on the porch, my phone still recording everything. Was. 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled up the street and parked behind the flatbed truck. 2 deputies got out. One was older, with a graying mustache and a weary look in his eyes that suggested had seen every kind of neighborhood dispute imaginable. The other was younger, barely out of his 20s, with a ramrod straight posture and an observant gaze. Brenda scurried over to them, launching into her story before they could even ask a question. "Thank you for coming, officers," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "This man, Mr. Peterson, has been a problem for months. The HOA has determined that this old building," she waved a hand dramatically at the wounded barn, "is a hazard. We have a crew here to legally remove it, and he came out of his house and started threatening us. We're all very shaken up." The older deputy, whose name tag read Miller, listened patiently, his expression unreadable. The younger one, Deputy Kent, looked from Brenda to me standing quietly on my porch, to the bulldozer with its shovel still embedded in the barn wall. He was taking in the whole scene. Sergeant Miller eventually turned his gaze to me. Sir," he called out, his voice polite but firm. Would you mind coming over here so I can have a word with you?" I stopped recording, saved the file, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I walked calmly across the lawn and stopped a respectful 10 feet from the officers. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said. This lady says you were threatening her and her work crew," Miller said, his eyes studying my face. No, sir," I replied calmly. "I informed this woman, Brenda, that she and her crew are trespassing on my private property, and that I have asked them to leave." I recorded the entire interaction. Brenda jumped in. "That is a lie. This is HOA common area. Has just trying to cause trouble because he lost the vote." Sergeant Miller held up a hand to silence her. He looked back at me. Sir, can you prove this is your property?" Yes, I can," I said. I did not have the full folder with me, of course. That would be overkill. For a moment like this, you only present what is necessary. You never show your whole hand. I pulled my wallet from my back pocket. I handed him my driver's license, which showed my name and the address of the house. Then I unfolded a single piece of paper I had placed in my pocket that morning. It was a copy of the first page of my deed, the one with the legal description of the property boundaries. Finally, I handed him the business card of the surveyor who had recently marked the property lines. "The survey stakes are still in place, Sergeant," I said quietly. "The one for the back corner is right over there, next to that oak tree. As you can see, this barn and the land this crew is on is well within my property line show, Sergeant Miller took the documents. He read my license. He read the deed. He looked over at the bright pink flag on the stake I had pointed to. He then looked at Brenda, who was now sputtering about HOA, jurisdiction, and overriding bylaws. Her face was getting red. Her fortress of confidence was developing a few cracks. The younger deputy, Kent, spoke for the first time. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, his tone professional. "Ah, a survey map and a deed are legal documents. The property line is not a matter of opinion. If the stakes show this is his land, then his land." Miller nodded, handing my papers back to me. He turned to Brenda. "Mum, at this point, this appears to be a civil matter, not a criminal one. I cannot order this man to leave his own property, and I cannot validate your right to be here. If you continue with this demolition without a court order specifying your right to do so, you could be opening yourself and your HOA up to significant legal liability." He was giving her the same out I had. He was giving her a chance to stop, to think, to retreat. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "Are you taking his side? I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I represent 37 families." "Ma'am, I don't take sides," Miller said, his voice losing its patient edge. "I just look at the facts presented. Right now, this gentleman has presented facts. You have presented an opinion. My advice is to stop work, consult an attorney, and get a judge to tell you what you can and cannot do." I knew she would not listen. Her ego was too invested. To back down now, in front of the crew and the deputies, would be an admission of defeat she was incapable of making. "A fine," she said through gritted teeth. "A fine." She looked at Miller. "Oh, but I want it on record that he was hostile." The sergeant sighed. He pulled out his notepad. This was my cue. "A sergeant," I said, my voice clear and formal. For the record, I would like to state the following. My name is Arthur Peterson. At approximately 6:45 a.m. this morning, a work crew hired by Brenda, acting as president of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA, illegally entered my property without my consent. They have begun to demolish a structure, a barn, that is legally mine. I have informed them they are trespassing. I have shown you my deed. I have asked them to leave, and they have refused. I am not being hostile. I am defending my property rights. I would like a copy of the official police report, please. Case number. And everything. I watched Sergeant Millery's pen move across the page, writing it all down. Deputy Kent was looking at me, with a new expression, a flicker of respect. I had not yelled. I had not threatened. I had simply stated facts and made a formal request. I was creating another piece of paper for my folder. The body camera footage from both officers would be another. Miller finished writing. He tore the top sheet off his pad and handed it to me. It had the case number on it. "It'll be available in a few days, Mr. Peterson," he said. He then turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, my official advice stands. I would pack up this crew, leave. But I cannot force you to. This is a civil dispute." He and Kent then walked back to their cruiser and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved tension in their wake. Brenda watched them go, her face a mask of fury. She had called the authorities to bend to her will, and they had refused. In her mind, this was an unacceptable breakdown of the natural order. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. You think you are so clever, don't it, you old man, with your little pieces of paper? I think the law is the law." "Brenda," I said quietly. "We'll see about that," she snarled. She spun around and marched back to the bulldozer operator. "I am paying you to do a job. Get it done now." The operator looked hesitant. He'd heard the sheriff, but a paycheck is a powerful motivator. He shrugged. climbed back into his cab, and the demolition of my barn began again. In earnest. I did not say another word. I just went back inside my quiet house, sat down at my desk, and emailed David. Plaques. The subject line was simple. They're proceeding Phase 2. The destruction was swift and brutal. The crew was efficient. They tore down the old oak timbers and splintered siding. They ripped up the heavy floorboards, and then they brought in an excavator with a jackhammer attachment to break apart the old stone foundation. That was the critical part, that was the point of no return. As they pulled the last of the big, granite foundation stones from the earth, I saw it. A dark, wet patch was beginning to form in the red clay soil. Water with nowhere else to go was beginning to seep toward the surface. It was subtle at first, just a dampness, a sheen on the mud. But I knew what it meant. The patient, relentless pressure was building. Just as the crew was finishing up, clearing the last of the debris into a large dumpster, I saw a figure hurrying across the lawn from the house next door. It was Mr. Henderson. He was a small, stooped man in his late 70s, a retired postal worker who had lived in his house for 40 years. Brenda had been tormenting him for years, fining him for the color of his trim, the state of his driveway, and, most cruelly, the small, immaculately kept vegetable garden he cherished. He looked terrified, clutching something in his hand. "Ah, Arthur," he whispered, his voice shaky, as he reached my porch. "I saw the whole thing. The sheriff, everything. That woman is a menace. She is George." I agreed. "Are you all right?" He nodded, but he was pale. "I have to give you this," he said, pressing a small USB thumb drive into my hand. His own hand was trembling. It is the recordings, all of them. From the last 2 years of HOA meetings, the part where she talked about you, about the barn, Ida's on there. She told everyone she had 2 separate engineers declare it a public nuisance, and that the county had ordered it torn down. She lied, Arthur. She lied to everyone. I closed my hand around the small piece of plastic and metal. This was more valuable than gold. This was proof of intent, of malice, of fraud. This was the evidence that would pierce the corporate veil of the HOA and attach liability directly to her. "George," I said, my voice thick with gratitude. "You have no idea how important this is, but you could get in trouble. She could come after you, AA. Let her," he said, a flicker of defiance in his tired eyes. "What is she going to do, find me again? I am tired of being afraid of that bully. You are the first person to ever stand up to her. The very least I can do is give you the ammunition." He squeezed my arm, then turned and scurried back to his house before he could be seen. An hour later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from a name I recognized from the HOA newsletters. Sarah Jennings. She was one of the 2 other members on the 3-person board of directors. A younger woman, a mother of 2, who had, I suspected, joined the board with good intentions. The email was short and to the point. "Mr. Peterson, I am resigning from the HOA board, effective immediately. I cannot be a party to what happened this morning. I have attached the complete email correspondence from the board regarding your property for your records. I was told to ignore your warnings. I was told you were a confused old man. I am so sorry. If you need me to testify, I will." Attached was a PDF file. I opened it. It was everything. My original warning letter. Brenda's email to the board dismissing it as a senile gibberish. The other board member, a man named Bob, replying, "ALO. You tell him, Brenda," and Sarah's own hesitant email asking if they shouldn't at least check the county records, an email to which Brenda had replied, "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah. I have got this handled. It was a complete documented record of their willful negligence. The coalition was forming. The fearful Ally and the disillusioned insider had both come forward. I was no longer alone. That evening Brenda made her final, fatal error. Flushed with victory, she sent a mass email to the entire Oak Ridge Meadows mailing list. The subject line read, AA Victory for Community Beautification. The email was a smug, self-congratulatory screed about her tireless efforts to uphold property values. She described the successful removal of the hazardous, derelict structure on the edge of the common area. She attached photos of the now empty patch of dirt, and at the bottom she included a link to the HOA portal, noting that a special assessment for community improvement and hazard abatement had been added to my account. The bill was for $15,700, the full cost of the demolition. I saved a copy of the email as a PDF and forwarded it, along with Sarah's emails and a note about Georgia's audio files, to David. His reply came back in less than 5 minutes. It said simply, a checkmate. The first heavy rain came 3 days later. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, soaking rain that lasted for about 8 hours. It was the kind of rain the old Barnaz drainage system had been designed to handle with ease. Without it, the results were immediate and predictable. The water, with no path of least resistance to the cistern and the county outflow pipe, followed the next easiest path, gravity. It saturated the clay soil and began to pool in the lowest lying areas, which happened to be the backyards of the 5 houses adjacent to my property. The most affected, by a quirk of grading, was Brenda's. By the next morning, her award-winning rose garden, the one featured in a local lifestyle magazine, was a shallow lake of muddy water. Her perfectly manicured lawn was a swamp. Mr. Henderson's property, which was slightly uphill from the disaster, was fine. My own property, also on higher ground, was fine. But Brenda's, and those of her closest neighbors and staunchest allies, were flooded. The panic started with a flurry of posts on the neighborhood social media page. Pictures of submerged patios and waterlogged flower beds. Frantic questions about who to call. Brenda, at first, was dismissive. She blamed a freak weather event and inadequate county infrastructure. She assured everyone she was on top of it. But then it rained again a few days later. The standing water got deeper. The ground became so saturated that septic systems started to back up. The smell began. The problem wasn't going away, it was getting worse. The remaining board member, Bob, called for an emergency HOA meeting to address the unprecedented flooding crisis. The meeting was to be held in the clubhouse, a small, sterile building near the community pool. This was it. The public confrontation. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed, every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The mood was tense, a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. These people's biggest investments were sinking into the mud, and they wanted answers. I arrived with David a few minutes before it started. I wore a simple tweed jacket and slacks. David was in a crisp suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. We didn't sit with the main group. We stood quietly at the back. Brenda and Bob were at a folding table at the front of the room, looking harried. Brenda called the meeting to order, her voice tight with forced composure. She launched into a well-rehearsed performance. She was the victim, the tireless leader battling forces beyond her control. Friends, neighbors, she began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I know this has been a difficult time for all of us. This flooding, it is a tragedy, it is an act of God. She spoke of her own ruined garden, her voice catching, as if she were about to cry. I have been on the phone, day and night, with the county, with engineers, with landscapers. The consensus is that our community's aging drainage systems have failed. under the strain of these unprecedented storms. She laid out her plan. She was proposing a massive special assessment, $50,000, to hire a top-tier engineering firm to conduct a full hydrological survey and design a modern, robust solution. She presented it as the only option, a painful but necessary expense to save their homes. She was trying to control the narrative to frame herself as the savior, not the cause. When she finished, a hand went up in the audience. It was Sarah Jennings, the former board member. Brenda," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Did the flooding start before or after you tore down Mr. Peterson's barn?" A murmur went through the room. And the question hung in the air. Brenda's face hardened. "That is an irrelevant and inflammatory question, Sarah," she snapped. "The two events are completely unrelated. We removed a dangerous eyesore. That has nothing to do with record rainfall." "I think it does," Sarah replied. "And I think you know it does." Before Brenda could respond, David stepped forward. "Madam President," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the chatter. "I am the legal counsel for Mr. Arthur Peterson. With the community's indulgence, my client and I would like to offer some clarification on the matter." All eyes turned to us. Brenda looked as if she'd seen a ghost. "You are not on the agenda," she stammered. "I believe, under the HOA bylaws, any homeowner has a right to speak during the open forum portion of an emergency meeting," David said smoothly. He had, of course, read the bylaws cover to cover. "And since you are proposing a $50,000 assessment related to a drainage issue, my client, a professional hydrologist with 43 years of experience, feels he has relevant information to share." The entire room was looking at her, waiting. To deny us the right to speak would look like she had something to hide. Fine," she spat. You have 5 minutes," David smiled. We will be brief," he said. He walked to the front of the room and opened his briefcase. He hadn't brought a projector or a fancy slideshow. He believed in the power of a single, devastating piece of paper. He started calmly, methodically. First," he said, holding up a document in a clear plastic sleeve, "this is a certified copy of the deed to Mr. Peterson's property. And this, he held up a second document, is a legally filed survey map from last month. As you can see, the barn that was demolished was, without any legal ambiguity, entirely on his private property and not subject to HOA authority." He paused, letting that sink in. "Therefore, the HOA, under the direction of its president, knowingly trespassed and destroyed private property valued, for insurance purposes, at over $200,000. A gasp went through the crowd. Brenda turned white. "A second," David continued, his voice even. "Mr. Peterson attempted to warn the board of the consequences. He sent this certified letter, he held it up, along with a signed receipt card, explaining that the barn's foundation was a critical part of the neighborhood's drainage system. The board, led by President Brenda, received this letter and willfully ignored it. Panat." He then looked at Brenda directly. "At a subsequent board meeting, you told the members you had consulted with 2 engineers and the county. We have an audio recording of that meeting. Would you like to hear it?" Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The confident, imperious leader was gone, replaced by a pale, terrified woman. She stared at David, her expression one of blank, uncomprehending horror. She finally realized the depth of her miscalculation. David did not wait for an answer. He moved to his final point. The kill shot. He held up the last document. And it was thick, yellowed with age. And, finally, he said, his voice dropping, slightly becoming grave, This is the most important document of all. This is the official variance granted by the county in 1978 that allowed this subdivision to be built. It was granted on one condition, that the drainage system tied to the Crofton Barna, Mr. Petersenna's Barna, maintained in perpetuity. By destroying that barn, your HOA president has not just caused a flood. She has willfully violated the foundational legal agreement that grants your homes their certificates of occupancy. Legally speaking, at this moment, none of your homes may be in compliance with county code. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, crushing silence, filled with the sound of 37 mortgages suddenly turning to dust. The homeowners water race looking at Brenda with anger anymore. It was worse than that. They were looking at her with the cold, dead eyes of financial ruin. They understood. She hadn't just flooded their basements. She had potentially invalidated their home insurance, their ability to sell their properties, their entire life savings. All because she didn't like the look of an old barn. All because she never bothered to read the paperwork. The aftermath was as swift and merciless as the demolition had been. The emergency meeting ended with a vote of no confidence and Brenda's immediate removal as president. The next day, David filed a comprehensive lawsuit on my behalf against the HOA and against Brenda and Bob personally, citing their gross negligence and willful misconduct, which allowed us to pierce the liability shield of the HOA. The HOA's insurance carrier took one look at the mountain of evidence, the certified letters, the emails from Sarah, George's audio recordings, the sheriff's report, the 1978 county variance, denied the HOA's claim. Willful destruction and acting against documented warnings were not covered. This left the HOA and its members on the hook for the entire bill. Facing a class action lawsuit from the other homeowners whose properties were damaged and devalued, Brenda and Bob had no choice. Their personal assets were on the line. They settled. The court's judgment was a masterpiece of procedural justice. They were ordered to pay, out of their own pockets, the full, appraised cost for the reconstruction of my barn to its exact 1890 specifications, but using modern durable materials. They were also ordered to pay for the complete reconstruction of the complex subgrade drainage system, with the work to be supervised and signed off on by me in my professional capacity as a hydrological engineer. My consulting fee for this supervision, a steep one, was also to be paid by them. They had to cover all of DeVita's legal fees, which were substantial. And finally, the court awarded me punitive damages for the trespass and destruction of property with malice. Brenda had to sell her house, the big one with the 3-car garage, to cover her share of the judgment. She and her husband moved away in the middle of the night. Bob, a follower to the end, had to take out a second mortgage. The special assessment she tried to levy against me was, of course, thrown out, and the $15,000 was added to the damages she had to pay. All of her petty fines against my neighbors were rescinded by the new board, and the money was refunded from the HOA's now depleted reserve funds. Mr. Henderson got a check for every dollar she had ever taken from him. He expanded his vegetable garden. A new board was elected, led by Sarah Jennings. They were sensible, reasonable people who understood that an HOA's job is to maintain a community, not rule it. Their first official act was to hire me as a paid consultant to develop a long-term water management plan for the neighborhood. I designed a system of bioswales and rain gardens that not only solved the drainage issues, but also created beautiful natural spaces full of native plants. The community, once united in fear of Brenda, began to heal. Neighbors started talking to each other again. The atmosphere of suspicion lifted. They were wary of me at first, this quiet old man who had brought down the queen. But they saw that I was fair, that my only demand had ever been to be left alone. Slowly, tentatively, friendships were forged over property lines. It has been a year now. I am sitting on my back porch in the same spot where I watched the destruction begin. It is 6:42 a.m. I have a cup of coffee in my hands. The sun is rising over the pine trees. So, the new barn stands before me, a perfect replica of the old one, its hemlock siding already starting to weather to a pleasant silver gray. The complex network of drains beneath it is working silently, invisibly, keeping the neighborhood dry and stable. Brenda's old house has a new family in it, a young couple with children whose laughter I can sometimes hear in the afternoons. They love the old stories of the area. On the large sliding door of the new barn, there's a small discreet brass plaque. It reads, "The Croft Barn, Est, 1890, rebuilt, 2024 Jew." It is a testament to the idea that some things are worth preserving. Some structures, like an old Barnes foundation, are invisible but essential. They are the quiet, unglamorous things that hold everything else up. And some people, driven by ego and a contempt for history, will try to tear them down, never understanding that the only thing they'll succeed in destroying is themselves. They mistake kindness for weakness and rules for mere suggestions. They never stop to think that the quietest man in the room might be the one who not only has the receipts, but also holds the original plat map, the county variants, and a deep, abiding respect for the patient, relentless power of water. On paper, it was always over. It just took a little while for reality to catch up. The peace is restored. The folder is closed. And the ground is at last firm beneath my feet.